What if the future moves too fast to be built? What if every time we try to capture tomorrow, it slips into the past before we can finish constructing it? Tomorrowland was created to show us the future, but today, it mostly shows us how we used to imagine the future. And that isn't just a design problem, it's a philosophical one. Because when a place called Tomorrowland stops trying to depict tomorrow, it forces us to ask, have we lost faith in the future? Or have we finally learned how impossible it is to predict? Walt Disney wasn't just an entertainer, he was a futurist. He believed that the future could be designed and that optimism, innovation, and human ingenuity weren't abstract ideas. He believed they could be built, lived, and experienced. Tomorrowland wasn't meant to be nostalgic, it was aspirational. It was a physical vision of a better tomorrow grounded in science, imagination, and collaboration. It was a space designed to cultivate curiosity, to inspire visitors to think, what could we achieve next? But today, modern Tomorrowland is almost entirely retrofuturistic, and that creates a paradox. A land called Tomorrowland that no longer attempts to depict tomorrow. It's a paradox that's as philosophical as it is visual, and it's what we're going to explore today in theme park philosophy. At its core, modern Tomorrowland holds two contradictory ideas at once. On one hand, it claims to represent the future. On the other, it avoids doing so. This isn't because Disney stopped caring, it's because building the future physically has become nearly impossible. Technology moves exponentially, while theme parks do not. By the time a ride or attraction opens, the future it depicts is already outdated. The flying cars, the domed cities, the futuristic gadgets imagined in the 1950s, they're fascinating to look at, but they are now frozen dreams of what might have been. So, Imagineers were left with a problem. How do you build a land about the future when the future keeps outrunning you? And so the solution out of necessity and not necessarily creative failure was retrofuturism. Instead of predicting what's next, Tomorrowland began referencing what the past imagined the future would look like. Not because it's accurate, but because it's stable, it's visually striking, and it's emotionally satisfying. And so, in order for Tomorrowland to survive, it abandoned tomorrow. Retrofuturism is comforting. It presents a future that's already been emotionally processed, a world without uncertainty, where technology is clean, benevolent, and aesthetically pleasing. But Tomorrowland wasn't originally meant to comfort. It was meant to provoke curiosity. It was meant to spark the imagination of young and old alike, to make them think, what could we achieve next? By leaning on nostalgia, retrofuturism subtly shifts that experience from anticipation to remembrance. Instead of asking, where are we going? We start asking, do you remember when we thought this was where we were going? Even the design elements, sleek silver rockets, atomic shapes, and glowing neon, now evoke memory more than speculation. They remind us of a cultural optimism that is no longer present in the same way, an optimism rooted in a particular era of post war progress. And that shift isn't just aesthetic, it shapes how we think about progress itself. Now, nostalgia itself is not bad. In fact, it's powerful. It connects memory, meaning, and identity. But when it dominates our vision of the future, something quietly changes. If Tomorrowland leans too heavily on retrofuturism, it risks reinforcing the idea that humanity's most hopeful visions are behind us and that our best futures are remembered and not imagined. It becomes a land of memory instead of possibility. And that's the philosophical discomfort, a land dedicated to tomorrow that primarily asks us to look backward. We celebrate old visions of the future, but we don't engage with the uncertainty, the risk, or the imagination that futurism originally demanded. So, how do Imagineers escape the paradox without abandoning Tomorrowland entirely? Well, they stop trying to represent the future literally, and instead, they use fantasy and science fiction intellectual property. Now, at first glance, franchises like Tron or Iron Man might seem like a retreat from futurism, but philosophically, it's more nuanced. See, these worlds don't claim to predict tomorrow, however, they explore ideas about tomorrow. Tron isn't a forecast, it's a modern myth, a digital world where humans interact with worlds creating artificial intelligence. Iron Man doesn't show real science, it's a fantasy of technological mastery, ethical responsibility, and of course, Tony Stark's ingenuity. But there's another layer here, and one that touches directly on philosophy. See, thinkers like Hans Vaihinger in the philosophy of as if remind us that humans often act as if certain ideas are true, even if they aren't literally true. Fiction, imagination, and hypothetical worlds guide behavior and thought. And philosophers like Nick Land, who coined the concept of hyperstition, describe how certain speculative narratives, stories, myths, or cultural ideas, can eventually help bring themselves into reality. In other words, imagining futures through science fiction and fantasy doesn't just entertain us, it subtly shapes how societies think, act, and innovate. In this sense, the Imagineers aren't just replacing futurism with fantasy, they are participating in it. Tron, Star Wars, Star Trek, of course, and other speculative worlds almost become self fulfilling. The stories we immerse ourselves in influence what we collectively strive to create. So, Tomorrowland becomes less about literally predicting the future and more about creating the conditions in which our imagination influence the real future. Looking back, Tomorrowland's turn to science fiction and fantasy isn't just a pragmatic escape from the limits of retrofuturism. By weaving narratives like Tron, Iron Man, and Buzz Lightyear into the land, Imagineers are doing something more profound. They're inviting us to act as if these ideas are real, to immerse ourselves in worlds that inspire curiosity, creativity, and wonder. Philosophers like Hans Vaihinger remind us that as if thinking shapes action, and Nick Land's concept of hyperstition shows that speculative stories can ripple outward, influencing how we collectively imagine and even build the future. Star Trek, anyone? And in this sense, by engaging with these fantastical worlds, Tomorrowland doesn't just depict a future, it participates in shaping it. Every ride, every story, and every imagined scenario is a small contribution to how we think, dream, and act towards what comes next. And so perhaps the lesson of Tomorrowland isn't about the impossibility of predicting tomorrow, and instead it's about embracing the active, ongoing work of imagination, using stories and fantasy not just to escape the present, but to shape the future as we hope to see it. And maybe that's exactly the kind of future worth exploring: unfinished, fantastical, and full of possibility. And with that, thank you guys for joining me on this episode of Theme Park Philosophy. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.